Ranger didn't growl like a normal dog. He didn't bark. He didn't scratch at the door. He just stood there, frozen, his body a tight coil of muscle and bone, ears pricked forward, gaze locked on the old wooden door at the end of the West Wing hallway. Nora Ellis stopped mid-step. The hallway was empty, lit only by the late afternoon sun bleeding in through frosted windows. The air was calm, tinged with lemon disinfectant and the quiet buzz of a working HVAC. It was the kind of peace people paid extra for. But peace, Nora was learning, could lie. She tugged Ranger's leash gently. "Come on, bud. We're done with rounds." He didn't move. Instead, a low, chest-deep growl rumbled from inside him, so low it made the hairs on Nora's arms stand straight. It wasn't loud, but it was full of warning. Not fear, not pain. A signal. "Ranger," she whispered, crouching beside him. The dog didn't glance at her. His gaze stayed fixed on room 113. The door didn't match the others. Older, heavier, a shade darker. The nameplate was blank, its brass frame tarnished and hung slightly crooked. A faint scuff of something dark clung to the bottom edge of the door, like dried rust. Or something worse. Nora had been working at Silver Pines nursing home for 6 weeks, long enough to learn the rhythm of the place, the smiles, the silences, long enough to know that Ranger, though aging and grey around the muzzle, still carried the discipline of a former DEA K9. He didn't spook easy. He didn't growl for no reason. Behind them, a cart clattered as an orderly turned the corner. Nora straightened, trying to shake the feeling clawing up her spine. "Everything all right, Nora?" The woman called, eyeing the frozen dog. "Yeah, Ranger's just acting weird." She forced a smile. The orderly frowned. "Don't linger near that room. It's sealed for a reason." Then she wheeled the cart away, like that explained anything. Nora looked down. Ranger was still growling, quiet but steady, still locked on the door. She gave his leash a firm tug this time. "Let's go." He hesitated. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he turned and followed. But not before casting one last look at room 113. That night, Nora couldn't sleep. Her apartment above the florist shop smelled like lavender, the way she liked it. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ranger, standing like a soldier, still and locked in, like something had clicked back on. She pulled out her phone and opened Silver Pine's internal map. Rooms 101 to 112. Check. 114 to 122. Check. Room 113. Nothing. She stared at the empty gap on the layout. No patient assigned, no maintenance record, no storage notation, just blank space, a misprint maybe. But her gut told her otherwise. When she returned to work the next morning, Ranger was already waiting at the reception with his volunteer handler, Mrs. Garcia. As always, the dog perked up when he saw Nora. But today there was something extra in his eyes, alertness. She bent down to pet him. "What did you smell yesterday, boy?" His ears flicked. That afternoon, as she walked him past the West Wing again, his body tensed. He pulled toward room 113. This time, she let him. She walked beside him slowly, heart pounding as they approached the sealed door. No noise, no light, nothing, until Ranger stopped again. Then came the growl. Not like before, this one was sharper. A bark shot out of him, quick and forceful, followed by another. 3 short barks, one pause, then one long, haunting growl that echoed down the empty hallway. "Ranger!" Nora hissed, kneeling beside him. He wouldn't stop. His nose twitched, catching something she couldn't. Then he pressed his body against the door. Hard. She glanced behind her. No one. Then she saw it, a thin sliver of light at the bottom of the door. It flickered. Not a hallway bulb. Something inside. She reached for the doorknob on instinct. Locked. Of course. Nora crouched, peering through the old-fashioned keyhole. At first, nothing. Then something moved. A shape. A figure. Slouched, slow, dragging something across the floor. It was human, maybe, but not whole, not right. She jerked back, her breath caught in her throat. Ranger stepped in front of her, his stance protective, tail stiff, eyes narrowed. She wanted to run, but her feet didn't move. A noise came from inside the room, scraping. Then silence. The next sound was the faint, almost imperceptible tap of fingers against glass. Window? Mirror? Or a camera? She stood up quickly. Come on, Ranger. They walked back in silence. Ranger kept glancing back. At dinner break, Nora sat in the employee lounge, barely touching her pasta. Across the room, Nurse Penny was scrolling her phone. Hey, Nora said casually. You ever hear anything weird about room 113? Penny looked up slowly. Why are you asking? Just curious. It's not on the map. Penny shrugged, but her eyes shifted. That wing's mostly unused. Some rooms got decommissioned years ago. Foundation problems or mold or something. Nora nodded, but her gut twisted. Back in her room that night, she opened her journal. She scribbled the words in quick strokes. Ranger knows. Room 113. Something's inside. And underneath that, if no one listens to a war dog, maybe it's because they're not ready for the war. She closed the notebook, heart still racing. Tomorrow, she decided, she would stop asking questions and start looking for answers. Ranger walked like he still had a badge. He moved with purpose, never dragging, never distracted. His steps were measured, ears in constant motion, nose twitching with every shift in air pressure. Even in retirement, there was something about the way he carried himself that made people stand a little straighter when he passed. Nora Ellis had been working with Ranger for just under 2 months, but she already knew he wasn't like the other therapy dogs who came through Silver Pines. He wasn't just a comforting presence. He was a presence, an ex-DEA K-9 with 6 years of service, 5 deployments, and the kind of resume that came with medals nobody talked about and scars nobody could see. He was supposed to be retired. That was the word everyone used when the agency placed him in the therapy program. Retired. But Ranger hadn't gotten the memo. Not really, he still worked, especially lately. Nora first noticed the change during their Tuesday morning rounds. Normally, Ranger greeted residents with soft eyes and a patient posture, leaning in for pets, pressing his head against fragile legs, offering quiet companionship to those who didn't get many visitors anymore. But this week, he skipped Mr. Conrad's room entirely, just walked past without a glance. Then he refused to enter the main rec room, even though it was filled with his favorite regulars, Mrs. Linwood, who always had biscuits in her cardigan, and Mr. Peck, who claimed he once trained bomb dogs for the Marines. Instead, he kept glancing down the west wing, not with curiosity, with suspicion. Ranger, Nora whispered, crouching beside him. What are you doing? His eyes never left the hallway. By the time they reached the break room, he was pacing in short loops, something she hadn't seen since his first week back from surgery. Mrs. Garcia, the volunteer handler who dropped him off each morning, noticed it too. He gets like this sometimes, she said, watching him pace. Usually when he smells something he doesn't like. One time he caught wind of a morphine leak in a hospice center. Just sat outside the room and barked till someone listened. Nora looked toward the west hallway. That part of the building creeps me out, she admitted. There's one door, room 113. No plaque, no name. But it feels like the air shifts when we pass it. Mrs. Garcia raised an eyebrow. That door still here? Yeah. The older woman tightened her grip on Ranger's leash. That's not good. Later that day, Nora asked her supervisor, Marcy, about the room. "Hey, do you know anything about room 113? She said casually as they sorted medication records. Marcy didn't even look up. "Old storage. It's sealed. No access." "But why doesn't it show on the digital map?" "Because it's not in use." Her tone was clipped, final. "You've been doing night shifts, right? Sometimes things feel off when you're tired." "I'm not imagining things." Marcy softened slightly. "Look, I don't know the history. Some rooms just aren't safe anymore. Mold, bad plumbing, cracked supports. That wing's old. Just stick to your assignment." Nora nodded, but didn't drop it. That night, she stayed behind after her shift. Not to snoop, at least that's what she told herself. Just to walk Ranger again, to get him to settle. He didn't. They made one lap around the perimeter, then again toward the West Hall. As soon as they turned their corner, Ranger tensed. His nose went to the floor, then the walls, then back to the floor. He sniffed all the way to room 113 and sat. Not barked, not growled, just sat, facing the door like a sentry on post. Nora sat beside him. "Are you telling me something's in there?" Ranger didn't move. She leaned back against the wall, breathing in the silence. It was thick, heavy. The hum of electricity from the overhead lights didn't reach this far. The walls seemed to swallow sound, like whatever was behind the door didn't want to be heard. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's say you're right. Let's say something's behind there. What am I supposed to do? Break in?" Ranger finally looked at her. Just for a second. Then turned back to the door. The next day she brought it up again. This time to one of the older residents, Mr. Hal Grady, who used to be a combat medic in Vietnam. She'd brought Ranger by for their usual check-in, but Hal surprised her with a question of his own. "Why won't he go near the west hallway anymore?" he asked, watching the dog settle near the door but keep his head facing the exit. "You've noticed?" Hal nodded. "You don't spend 30 years watching wounded men twitch under blankets without learning to read body language. That dog smells something. You can see it in his spine." Nora leaned in. "Do you know anything about that hallway? Room 113? Hal hesitated, then said, "There was talk, years ago, about a man, not a patient, not staff either, just placed here, quiet-like." "Placed by who?" Hal stared out the window. "That's the question, isn't it?" Ranger shifted beside him, letting out a soft whine. "Maybe you should stop asking questions, honey." Hal added, voice gentler. "Places like this don't like people poking around in their dead corners." Dead corners. The phrase clung to her for the rest of the day. That evening, Ranger refused to leave the staff office. He stood guard by the glass door that overlooked the hallway. Not barking, just watching. A low, silent alarm waiting to go off. By now, Nora was done pretending nothing was wrong. She stayed late again, this time with a flashlight tucked into her coat pocket. If she couldn't get answers from her supervisor or the residents, she'd find them herself. Just before midnight, she and Ranger walked the hall in silence. When they reached room 113, he stopped again. Sat down. Waited. She crouched beside him. Then noticed something new. A soft clicking sound, almost like mechanical breathing, coming from behind the door. It lasted for 3 seconds. Then silence. She reached into her coat and pulled out a tiny recorder she used for patient notes. Pressed record, held it against the door. Just static. No clicking, no voice, nothing. She turned it off and tucked it away. Then she saw it. A faint smudge on the baseboard beneath the door. Greasy. Fresh. Ranger sniffed it once, then let out a low, trembling growl. Nora stood up, heart pounding. She didn't know what was in that room, but she knew without a doubt that Ranger did. And whatever it was It hadn't retired either. It started with the scent. Not to Nora, not to anyone else. But Ranger felt it. They had just finished their mid-morning loop through the rec hall when the old dog suddenly froze mid-stride. His nose lifted, twitching like a radar locking onto a signal too faint for human senses. His body went stiff, tail low, ears pinned forward with a tension that buzzed under his fur. Nora turned, already knowing. "West Wing?" she whispered. Ranger's answer came in the form of a tremor. His entire body shivered once, not out of fear but instinct. She followed him as he crept forward, one slow step at a time, the leash slack between them. Room 113 loomed at the far end of the corridor. The door looked the same, unchanged, unmarked, but something felt different. Ranger's nose brushed the edge of the baseboard. He let out a soft whine, backed up, then circled once and sat directly in front of the door. Watching. Waiting. "Okay, boy," Nora murmured. "What are you trying to tell me?" There was nothing. No draft, no light, no sound. And yet Ranger refused to leave. Later that day, Nora brought it up again, this time in the staff lounge. "Do you know what's behind room 113? She asked casually, directing the question toward Louise, a nurse's aide who'd worked at Silver Pines for nearly a decade. Louise glanced up from her crossword puzzle, then lowered her voice. "That old wing? Yeah, my patient list skips 113 completely. Doesn't show on the online schedule either." Louise hesitated. "We used to call that side the tech corridor. It had wiring panels, backup generators, server racks, all sealed now. Mold or asbestos, I think. But the door's solid wood, not like the others. That one's older. Might have been an original structure from the hospital days." Nora frowned. Silver Pines was a hospital. Decades ago, before it turned private in the 90s, Louise tapped her pen against the table. "There's stuff here from before 2010 that no one talks about. Records went digital, files got archived, and a lot of things just disappeared." Nora leaned forward. "Like what?" Louise looked around, lowered her voice. "People. Staff, mostly. Some patients. We had a night nurse vanish mid-shift once. Administration said she moved. But her locker was full. Her scrubs were in the dryer." Nora's skin prickled. "And 113. Louise's mouth tightened. "I heard they sealed it after a fire. Something electrical. Never reopened. Best to leave that part alone." But Ranger wouldn't. That evening they passed the hallway again during Nora's break. She wasn't even headed that way, just walking Ranger to the courtyard. But the moment they neared the west corridor, he pulled. Hard. "Ranger," she warned, trying to steady him, but he was locked in again. Nose high, tracking. Something. He stopped just short of the door this time and stood like a statue, and then, without warning, he barked. Once, short, sharp, echoing. "Quiet," Nora hissed, looking around. No one else was there. She dropped to one knee beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. His muscles were tight. Quivering. "What do you smell?" she whispered. His eyes flicked to the door, then to the floor. A second later, he did something he'd never done before. He laid down, not in rest, in position, like a sentry preparing for a siege. Nora didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she decided to visit Mr. Avery, a retired military doctor who had been living in Silver Pines since a stroke took his left side. He wasn't chatty most days, but he liked Ranger. Always had. She brought the dog to his room and waited until the old man looked up from his book. "Hey, Doc," she said gently. "Can I ask you something strange?" His eyes twinkled faintly. "If it involves that dog, ask away." Nora nodded toward Ranger, who had curled up at Avery's feet. "He's been acting weird. Keeps going to a room in the West Wing." Yuzonuch Avery's expression shifted, ever so slightly. "That room," Nora continued. "Do you know anything about it?" The old man was silent for a long beat. Then, voice low, he said, "Some doors stay shut for a reason, Miss Ellis." She leaned forward. "Why?" "There are things," he said slowly, "that were done here, quietly. Rooms that were used for programs nobody wanted to admit existed." "Programs?" Ivory's eyes flicked towards the door. Before this place became Silver Pines, it ran under a different name. Mercy Glen Medical. Federal contracts, behavioral observation, memory studies, trauma suppression. That wing was part of it. Nora felt her heart start to thud. "You worked here then?" "I consulted. Saw things I wish I hadn't." His eyes locked on hers. "There are rooms that shouldn't be opened again. But your dog doesn't believe that." She swallowed hard. "What was in them?" "I don't know," he whispered, "but I remember the screaming. Nights when alarms would go off and no one would answer. Security with no uniforms, unmarked vans." "Are you saying someone's still in there?" "I'm saying something might be." He reached down, brushing his hand over Ranger's thick fur. Dogs remember things people try to forget. Back in her room that night, Nora stared at the notebook she kept on her nightstand. She flipped back through the pages. Her handwriting had grown sharper lately. Shorter, like she didn't want to waste time anymore. She wrote, "Ranger smells something that never left." Then added, "I think this place has ghosts." "But they breathe." She closed the book. Behind her, Ranger lifted his head and stared toward the west window. Waiting. Watching. Listening. The moment Nora stepped into Director Monroe's office, she regretted it. The room smelled like freshly brewed coffee and plastic plants, calculated comfort. Framed certificates lined the wall, but the clock ticked the loudest, slicing the silence into tight little pieces. Monroe was already seated, a half smile plastered across his face. "You asked for a meeting?" he said, as if she were here to schedule vacation time, not question the foundations of his facility. Nora nodded, clutching her notepad a little too tightly. "I need to talk to you about room 113. Monroe's smile didn't move. "We don't have a room 113. Her jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, we do. It's at the far end of the west wing. The door is sealed, but it's still active. Ranger's been reacting to it for days." That made him blink. "You're basing this on the behavior of a dog." She leaned forward. "He's not just a dog. He's a retired DEA K-9 with a nose trained for narcotics, explosives, even cadavers. He doesn't bark without a reason." Monroe exhaled slowly and folded his hands. "Nora, how many overnights have you pulled this month?" 14, she said. He nodded. "And how many patients do you currently monitor?" 12. "And in your spare time, you're investigating sealed doors based on a hunch from a therapy dog." "It's not a hunch," she snapped, then caught herself. "I've seen movement under the door, smelled something off. Ranger's refusing to enter that part of the wing. I even spoke to a resident who—" "Mr. Avery," Monroe cut in, finally dropping the smile. "A stroke patient who also claims he once treated Cold War prisoners in Berlin." Nora's breath caught. "You're tired," he continued. "You're a good nurse, but this place has its shadows. You've been staring into one too long. Take a couple days. Clear your head." She stood up, pulse pounding. "You're dismissing this because it's inconvenient." "I'm dismissing it because it's nothing." She left without another word, fury tightening in her chest like a vice. That afternoon, Ranger lunged. It happened outside the west hallway. Nora had loosened his leash slightly while greeting Mrs. Linwood, who was seated with her crossword at the corridor junction. One moment, Ranger was still. The next, his head snapped toward room 113 and he charged. Full force, leash taut in a heartbeat, teeth bared, a deep bark erupting from his chest like a warning bell. Nora barely managed to hold him back. "Ranger!" she cried, straining against his weight. Staff came running. "Is he attacking?" Someone yelled. "No!" she panted. "He's reacting to something in that room. He needs to be removed from patient areas." A nurse snapped. "That's a safety issue." By the time she got him calmed, Director Monroe had arrived, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 members of the admin team. "He's unstable," the assistant manager said. "There's no documentation to justify his continued presence if he's displaying aggressive behavior." "He's not aggressive," Nora said, still kneeling beside Ranger, who was panting heavily, eyes fixed on the sealed door. "He growled, he barked, he lunged," Monroe recited, tapping the clipboard. Nora stood. "He did what dogs do when they sense danger, or when they're aging out of the job," Monroe countered. Nora's throat burned. "You're going to pull him out of the program for doing his job too well? I'm going to suspend his visitation privileges until further notice, for safety." Nora looked down at Ranger. He wasn't pulling now. He wasn't barking. He just stood beside her, breathing heavy, eyes still locked on the door, tail stiff, unmoving. He knew he was being silenced. So did she. That evening, as she led him out of the building toward Mrs. Garcia's waiting car, she hesitated by the parking lot. Ranger paused too, casting one last look over his shoulder, back toward the West Wing. Not confused, not afraid, determined. Like he wasn't done. Nora crouched beside him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. His eyes met hers, and in that silent second, she knew. Ranger wasn't backing down, even if everyone else did. It happened fast. Too fast for Nora to stop him. One moment, she was walking Ranger past the supply closet outside the east stairwell. The next, a maintenance worker rounded the corner, whistling, jangling a ring of keys from his belt. And Ranger lunged, not with a snarl, not with aggression, but with absolute precision. His teeth clamped gently on the man's tool belt, yanked hard, and pulled free the entire key ring before Nora could shout. "Whoa!" the man cried, startled. "Hey, hey! I'm so sorry!" Nora gasped, grabbing Ranger's collar. But Ranger wasn't pulling anymore. He had already dropped the keyring at her feet, then backed off, tail still, eyes on her like he'd just handed her the answer she hadn't known she was searching for. The maintenance man grumbled but waved it off. "Weird dog. Just bring that back when you're done pretending to be Nancy Drew." He walked off. Nora stood frozen, the keys clutched in her hand. They were standard-issue facility keys, plastic tags on each one, supply, boiler, elevator, medical, and one with no tag at all. Old brass, slightly rusted, worn smooth at the edges, a number etched so faintly it looked almost accidental. That night, she didn't go home. She stayed past her shift, pretending to reorganize charts, feigning busyness until the halls went quiet, and the skeleton crew of overnight staff thinned out. By 2 a.m., the only people left were a security guard who never left his booth, a nurse covering the hospice wing, and her, and Ranger. He moved beside her like a shadow as she crept down the west hallway. The silence back there was different. Not peaceful, not soothing. It was defensive. When they reached room 113, Nora paused, keys clutched tight, breath shallow. Ranger sat without being told, ears perked, nose pointed straight at the door. "You ready?" she whispered. He didn't move. She slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The door groaned open, and the smell hit her. Stale air, sharp with bleach and something older, something buried. Like an abandoned clinic where the walls still remembered what had happened inside. Her flashlight beam swept the room. 2 hospital beds, one empty, the other occupied, both made. Machines long disconnected sat dormant in corners. A cracked fourth pole leaned against a wall. The paint peeled in thick flakes from the ceiling, revealing rusted metal beneath. And in the far corner, half in shadow, half in light, sat a man in a wheelchair, turned toward the wall. Nora's mouth went dry. "Hello?" she said softly. No response. She stepped inside, heart pounding, Ranger at her side. The man didn't move. He looked as old as the room, hunched, skeletal, wrapped in layers of clothing that looked issued, not chosen. As they drew closer, she saw his hands. Still, clasped in his lap, one twitching slightly, like a short-circuited wire. He turned his head, slowly, pale eyes, clouded but aware. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, voice brittle as parchment. I'm a nurse," she said. "I didn't know anyone was in this room." He gave a dry chuckle. "That's the point." Ranger didn't growl, but he stood between Nora and the man, alert, watching. The man didn't flinch. Good instincts. He's smarter than the rest of them. "What's your name?" Nora asked. He didn't answer, just looked at her like she should already know. "People call me Mr. Reed," he said at last, though I doubt that's my real name anymore. She glanced around the room. "There's no medical file, no logs. You're not listed anywhere." "Number I'm not." He nodded once, slow. "They erase what they don't want found." She hesitated. "Why are you here?" Instead of answering, he pointed to the nightstand beside him. Nora stepped closer, opened the drawer. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook. Old, worn, edges curling. She picked it up carefully. "If you're reading that," Reed said, "it means you already saw more than you were supposed to, which means it's too late to unsee it. What is this? Proof. Of what?" He looked at her, and for the first time, something sharp flickered behind the cloud in his eyes. "Of what they did," he said, "and what they buried. That book, it's not a story, it's a map." Nora opened to the first page. No title, just a date. September 3rd, 2009, followed by a list of names, each crossed out in red. Some had notes, others just numbers. Then another entry. Subject 13. Moved, not terminated. She flipped further. Technical sketches. Dosages. Annotations in tight handwriting. Descriptions of reactions, memory gaps, neural data. A sentence circled 3 times. Memory suppression successful. External triggers remain. Her stomach turned. She closed the notebook slowly. "You stayed here," she said, "to protect this." "No," Mr. Reed replied, "to make sure someone else found it." "Why me?" He looked down at Ranger. "Because he chose you." Nora didn't speak. Couldn't. The room felt like it was closing in around her. She turned towards the door. Ranger moved with her, always between her and the shadows. Before she left, she looked back one last time. Mr. Reed hadn't moved, just sat there, staring at the wall again, like he was waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to come through that door. She locked it behind her. Her hands were shaking. Ranger leaned into her side. A silent vow. He was still on duty. So was she. The notebook smelled like dust and old leather, like something that had been waiting too long to be touched. Nora sat on the floor of her small apartment, back against the couch, knees drawn up. Ranger lay beside her, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert in the way he always was when the world turned quiet. She flipped open the cover again. No title, no author, just page after page of tight handwriting. Clinical, cold. The words didn't read like journal entries. They read like logs, reports, some in pen, others typed and glued onto the pages. She started at the beginning. Phase 1, external trauma induction, memory collapse within expected threshold. Primary subject responded to 32-hour isolation with immediate regression. Her stomach tightened. The dates were scattered across years. Most of the early entries were from 2007 through 2009. Some had subjects referred to only by numbers. Others had red ink slashing through names with the word failed or terminated. But one name repeated. Langford. Sometimes signed with initials, EL. Other times with full authority. Dr. Ellis Langford, Lead Neuropathic Director. The tone was always clinical, detached, and behind it all, a phrase kept reappearing in the margins. Project Meridian. Nora's hands trembled. She had heard the name before, years ago. A congressional hearing that briefly made headlines, an experimental neuroscience program under review for ethical violations. The media had spun it as nothing more than a fringe attempt to treat PTSD through artificial memory suppression. The government pulled the plug in 2010. Or so they claimed. Ranger shifted beside her and let out a soft grunt. She looked at him. You knew something was wrong before I even did. His tail thumped once against the hardwood, then stilled. She flipped further. The pages grew darker. Descriptions of behavioral resets, memory mapping, stimulus conditioning. Then came a new type of entry. Handwritten, sloppier, rushed. Patient 13 shows sustained resistance. Retention. Returns in fragments after sedation breaks. Recommend full isolation. And finally, circled 3 times in red. If 13 recovers fully, we risk exposure. Nora closed the notebook. The silence in her apartment felt heavier than it had any right to be. Later that evening, she returned to Silver Pines. Technically, she wasn't on shift, but the night nurse had called out, and no one had argued when she offered to step in. Ranger came too, muzzle wrapped in a faded therapy vest that barely hid the gleam in his eyes. He wasn't there to comfort. He was there to find something. They walked the west hallway like ghosts. The lights flickered slightly as they passed. Ranger's nose dipped low again, tail rising, tension building through his spine. When they passed room 113, he didn't stop. He kept walking. And then he did something strange. He veered left, toward the end of the hall. Not toward any room, but toward the old wall near the broken emergency exit, where peeling paint curled like dying leaves. He sniffed along the baseboard, then sat. Nora followed, confused. What is it? He stood and moved again. This time, his nose hovered close to the wall, right at the seam where one panel met another. Then he barked. Once, short, clipped. She stepped closer, running her hand along the wall, and then she felt it. A shift in temperature. A draft. She pressed against the panel. It didn't move. But the wall wasn't solid. She could hear it now, something faint, something behind. A mechanical hum. Not loud, but constant. Familiar in a way she couldn't place, like hospital machinery buried in the bones of the building. Ranger pawed at the base of the wall, then whined. She dropped to her knees, pushing against a cracked section near the corner. It gave. Barely, but enough. A portion of the wall, a false panel, slid back with a soft hiss, revealing something she hadn't expected. Metal, cold, clean, industrial. A door, unlike anything else in the building. It wasn't part of the nursing home. It didn't match the structure. This was built in. And to the right of the doorframe, nestled into the drywall, was a biometric scanner. Nora stared. Why would a nursing facility have this? Ranger growled low in his throat. He stepped closer to the seam, sniffed once, then backed away, tail stiff. Nora reached forward and touched the panel beside the scanner. It blinked red. No access. Of course not. She looked at Ranger. Whatever's behind this, it wasn't meant for us. He didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. Nora stood, heart racing. She pressed her ear against the door. That hum again. Closer now. A tone that vibrated just slightly in her chest cavity. Not like an air vent. More like electric current. Behind her, Ranger let out a low, warning bark. And then, silence. The hum stopped. She backed away from the door. What the hell is this place? No answer, just the sound of her own breathing and the steady rhythm of Ranger's pause as he paced once behind her, then stood beside her again. Whatever was hidden behind that steel door, whatever Project Meridian had started, it hadn't ended in 2010. It had just gone underground. Right here, at Silver Pines. And now, thanks to a dog who wouldn't stop barking, the past had started to surface. The hallway was darker than usual. It wasn't the lights. Those still flickered with the same old tube fatigue. But the silence. The kind of silence that didn't just suggest emptiness. It warned of it. Nora moved quietly, her steps light, rubber soles barely making a sound on the polished tile. Ranger padded beside her. No leash, no commands. He didn't need them. His movements were focused, deliberate. A quiet urgency pulsed in the air between them. She had timed it perfectly. 2 staffers out sick. 1 night nurse covering both wings. Security detail swapped out for new contractors who hadn't learned the layout. Just enough of a gap. And tonight, she wasn't just looking for answers. She was going in. Ranger stopped in front of the false panel at the end of the west hallway. Same draft, same mechanical hum. Except tonight, the hum was stronger. Nora pulled the panel open. The steel door gleamed back at her, cold and waiting. She raised the stolen portable scanner she'd checked out from the front desk earlier. A basic biometric override device meant for patient wristbands. No one would suspect it could be repurposed, but Nora had rerouted its firmware with the help of a friend from EMT training who owed her a favor and didn't ask questions. The scanner blinked red at first, then green. Access granted. The lock disengaged with a low, solid click. Ranger didn't wait. He pushed the door open with his nose, stepped inside, and paused. Nora followed. It was colder in this hallway. Not just from temperature. The air felt older, heavier. The walls were concrete now, not drywall. Overhead lights buzzed faintly, motion activated in sequence as they walked through. They passed 1 locked storage room, then another, and then a second door, smaller, sealed with a simple keypad and bolt. But unlike the others, it had a small viewing panel. Nora stepped closer and looked through. There was someone inside, a woman, thin, hair shaved close to the scalp, limbs strapped to a narrow cot with heavy fabric restraints. Her eyes were open, wide, not blank, but focused on nothing. A faint 4th line ran from her arm to an ancient-looking machine that ticked quietly in the background. Nora's stomach dropped. She reached for the bolt, unlocked it, then slowly turned the handle and stepped inside. The smell was a mix of antiseptic and stale skin. She crouched beside the cot. Ranger stood at the door, silent, watching. "Hey," Nora whispered. "Can you hear me?" The woman's head tilted slightly. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Nora leaned in. "Patient. Echo." The woman breathed. Nora froze. That name, it was in the notebook. Scribbled in the margins. Subject 13. Echo. Resistance to treatment. High memory retention. Not terminated. You weren't supposed to be alive. Nora thought. But here you are. "I'm going to get you out," she whispered. The woman didn't nod, didn't react. but a tear slipped from the corner of her eye. Nora moved quickly, unfastening one restraint at a time, whispering calming reassurances she wasn't sure the woman could hear. Then it happened. A sharp alarm blared from the hallway. Not a fire alarm, not a medical alert. Security. Nora's heart seized. Ranger barked, loud, once, then growled low in his chest. Bootsteps. Close. Heavy. She turned toward the door just as two men in black stepped inside, masks half up, stun batons raised. "Don't move!" One barked. Ranger did. He launched at the first man's arm, not biting through flesh, but grabbing the wrist just hard enough to knock the baton aside. The man yelped, stumbled back. The second swung toward Ranger. Nora screamed, "No!" But Ranger ducked the baton, pivoted, and rammed his shoulder into the man's leg, sending him crashing into the supply cabinet. The first man reached for a radio. Ranger lunged again, forcing the hand back. "Go!" Nora yelled. She grabbed Patient Echo. No, not patient. No one deserved that label. The woman barely stood, but Nora hoisted her onto her feet, slung one arm over her shoulder. "Ranger, let's move!" Ranger released the man's wrist and darted into the hallway ahead of them, barking twice. Warning. Directional. He led them down the corridor, barking once at a left turn. And then Nora saw it. A faded exit sign above an old maintenance door, barely lit, partially blocked by a rolling shelf. Mr. Reed's voice echoed in her head. "Not all exits are where they belong. You just have to know where to look." Nora shoved the shelf aside. Ranger growled again, standing guard while she unlocked the door with shaking fingers. It opened. Cold air hit her face. Outside. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the woman through the threshold, Ranger right behind. Behind them, the alarm still howled. But the night was silent. They didn't stop running until they reached the tree line behind the facility. Nora's car was parked 2 blocks down. She helped the woman into the back seat. Ranger climbed in after her and pressed himself against her side like a blanket. The woman trembled, but not in fear. She looked at Nora, eyes clearer now. "You're real," she whispered. Nora nodded. "So are you." They drove into the dark, away from the building that had stolen a decade of a life, away from the secrets that were no longer content to stay buried. And Ranger, from the passenger seat, never looked away from the rearview mirror, watching, still on duty. The woman hadn't spoken her real name until the 3rd day. She'd been quiet, her body stiff from too long in restraints, her voice raw from disuse. Nora let her sleep, brought water and soft food, and sat with her through the long silences that came between panic jolts and blank stares. And through it all, Ranger never left her side. He slept curled up at the foot of the bed when she dozed. When she woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, eyes wide with something that didn't belong to this world, he was there. His presence wasn't loud. It was grounding, a living anchor. On the 3rd morning, after a night of tremors and hallucinated screams, she whispered it. "My name is Claire." Nora turned to her from the kitchen doorway. "Claire. Claire Hudson." Her eyes stared at the ceiling. "I used to be a med student. Johns Hopkins. I was working on a research paper about experimental neuroplasticity models." Nora walked closer, barely breathing. "I remember being approached by a man." Claire continued. "He said he worked for a federal research agency, that they'd seen my published paper on trauma memory retention. They offered me a paid internship. Off the books, but legit. I signed. I never asked enough questions." She swallowed hard. "I was supposed to be there for 12 weeks. That was in 2011. Claire didn't cry. That's what hit Nora the hardest. There were no tears, just an emptiness that had learned how to survive without explanation. Nora reached over and rested a hand on her shoulder. Ranger pressed his head against Claire's palm. I shouldn't remember anything, Claire said softly. They told me I wouldn't, over and over, but something cracked through, maybe because of him. She scratched behind Ranger's ear. He knew, before I did. Later that afternoon, Nora made a call she hadn't planned to make. Not to a supervisor. Not to the police. She called someone she had heard whispers about during her emergency response training, a former Department of Health and Human Services investigator named Maddox, who had allegedly been let go after pushing too hard into something called Meridian. She didn't leave a message. But 20 minutes later, her phone rang. "Where did you hear that name?" The voice on the line was low, gravel thick. "I have someone who survived it," she said. Silence. "Where are you?" They met in the back booth of a closed-down diner 2 towns over. The blinds were drawn. The sign on the door said closed, but Maddox had a key. He looked like someone who'd stopped trying to play by the rules a long time ago. Rumpled coat, salt and pepper beard, eyes that scanned the entire room every time she spoke. Nora brought Ranger. Claire stayed behind. Maddox watched the dog carefully as he slid a folder across the table. "I looked into Silver Pines years ago, back when it was called Rose Hill Medical. There were gaps in the paperwork. Funding allocations didn't match the staff rosters. Equipment billed that never showed up on record." "So why'd the investigation stop?" Nora asked. "They shut me down. Said it was a mismanaged renovation project. I knew it was deeper, but no one wanted to hear it." He paused. Then Meridian got shut down. Officially, Congress called it scientifically unsound. Privately, it was becoming a liability. Too many side effects. Memory collapses, psychosis, deaths, and Claire. She wasn't in any of the public files. But I've seen this before. The program didn't end. It went dark. Contracted out to private firms, no oversight. That's where Rose Hill came in. Nora's stomach twisted. "They used her as a lab rat." Maddox nodded. "Most patients were selected for their isolation. No family ties, homeless, veterans with trauma, mentally unstable individuals, easy to discredit, easy to hide." "She wasn't any of that," Nora said. "She was just curious, bright. They saw potential." Maddox leaned forward. "And now she's living proof they didn't succeed, which means you're sitting on a bomb." Ranger shifted beside her, ears perked. The sound of a passing car outside drew his eyes. He didn't growl, but he didn't relax either. "They'll come for her, won't they?" Nora asked. Maddox didn't answer, just opened another file. Inside were images, grainy black and whites, floor plans, names of shell companies, contracts issued to Rose Hill through third-party research firms. None of them linked directly to the government, but they all pointed in one direction. "They built it to disappear people," Maddox said, "and it worked for a long time." Ranger's nose twitched. He looked toward the window again, tail flat against the booth. Nora stood. "We have to move her." Maddox nodded. "I have contacts. Quiet ones. People who specialize in keeping things buried. Except this time, for the right reasons." They stepped outside just before dusk. The sky had turned orange behind the diner's roofline. Nora opened the car door for Ranger first. He jumped in, never taking his eyes off the street. "Your dog," Maddox said. "He's not just a pet." Nora looked at him. He was trained to protect, but he chose to protect what others ignored. As they drove away, Ranger's head stayed high, watching, guarding. Claire's breathing was steadier that night. She said her full name again without flinching. Then she asked Nora to write it down. "Just in case," she said, "in case they try again." Ranger curled up beside her, but his eyes stayed open. Sleep was a luxury he hadn't earned yet, not while danger still wore the mask of silence. The courtroom was quiet in that way only a government building could be. Long ceilings, worn tile floors, and fluorescent lights that buzzed just loud enough to remind you they'd never been replaced. There were no news crews, no fanfare, just a sign outside that read, "Closed session. Witness hearing 4B." But inside, the air was heavy with the weight of what was about to be said. Nora sat at the front, back straight, hands steady on her lap. Ranger lay at her feet, wearing his therapy vest, the one with the faded patch reading Retired K9. But nothing about him looked retired now. His body was still, his eyes were not. They tracked every sound, every movement from the door. The hearing was overseen by 3 state officials, 2 from the Public Health Oversight Committee, 1 from an independent civilian review board. They looked tired before anything had even started, like they'd read too many reports, heard too many cases, and knew the system had holes that sometimes bled quietly in the dark. But they didn't know this story. Not yet. Nora was called first. She stood and approached the witness table. Ranger followed, lying down beside her chair without command. "State your name for the record," the lead official said. "Nora Ellis, registered nurse, Silver Pines Long-Term Care Facility." "And your reason for testifying today?" She looked up. Because what happened inside that building was not care. It was control. The room shifted, ever so slightly. Someone leaned forward. A pen stopped scratching. She took a breath. Over a period of 12 years, patients were held without documentation. One of them was a woman named Claire Hudson, who was kidnapped, medically restrained, and subjected to neurological testing under a program called Project Meridian. "You understand, Ms. Ellis," one official interrupted, "that there are no active records of such a program." "I know," she said. "That's why I brought proof." She turned and nodded. The side door opened. Claire walked in, slowly, pale but composed. Her hair was starting to grow back. Her frame still bore the thinness of prolonged confinement, but her steps were steady. She wore no makeup, no dramatics, just truth. Ranger rose as she approached and walked beside her like an escort. He never left her side. Claire took the seat next to Nora. "Please state your name," the official said. "Claire Hudson." "And your relation to this case?" Claire paused, then looked up, locking eyes with the board. "I was patient Echo. I was held in a sub-level room of Silver Pines from September 2011 until last month. I was told I had volunteered, that I was helping the future of trauma treatment, but they never let me leave." One of the board members shifted. Another scribbled a note. Claire continued. "I remember the drugs, the fluorescent light that never turned off. I remember the sound of static they played through the walls. And I remember a man." She swallowed hard. "Dr. Ellis Langford." The room went still. "He used to stand at the end of my bed with a clipboard. He'd say, 'You're not a person anymore, Claire. You're what we made.' And I still remember the smell of the chemical compound they pumped into my IV, like rubbing alcohol and melted plastic." She looked down, then at Ranger. "And I remember this dog." The board looked confused. Claire nodded toward him. "When he found me, I hadn't spoken in days, but I knew the sound of a dog that didn't back down. I followed that sound out." Silence. No one asked a follow-up, because there wasn't one to ask. Later, Nora presented the physical evidence, the notebook from room 113, pages of falsified inventory logs, scans of biometric locks never disclosed on official blueprints. Maddox had compiled additional files, traced financial routes from shell companies to outdated Department of Defense contracts. The connections were real, and now they were on record. Before the hearing closed, a final item was announced. The room hushed as one of the board members stood and said, We would like to recognize the actions of an individual who, without voice or rank, helped expose a hidden program that violated the fundamental rights of human beings. He turned to Nora. Ms. Ellis, would you bring Ranger forward? Nora blinked, stunned. Then she rose. Ranger followed. The official held up a small, circular medal, embossed with a paw print and the state seal. This commendation is issued by the Civilian Public Safety Committee in recognition of Ranger, a retired K-9 officer whose actions directly led to the rescue and protection of a human life and the exposure of a hidden medical program operating outside the law. The room was quiet as the medal was clipped gently to Ranger's vest. He didn't move, but his tail wagged once, quiet, steady. A few moments later, as the room emptied, Claire leaned down beside him and whispered, "They thought I'd forget. But you didn't let me." Ranger pressed his head into her shoulder. Not as a gesture, but as a vow, one that never needed words. The wind smelled different out here. Cleaner, quieter, no bleach, no machines humming just beneath consciousness, no metal doors waiting to lock behind you. Claire Hudson had a new name now, a small rental house tucked into the woods of northern Oregon, a garden she was learning to grow, a coffee mug she chose herself, chipped but hers. Healing hadn't been linear. Some nights the nightmares still came. Sometimes she forgot what day it was or flinched at sudden sounds. But now there were no IV drips, no coded names, no people in masks telling her she was someone else. There was only air, light, and space to be a person again. She hadn't seen Nora in months, not in person, but they messaged every week. Claire still sent Ranger homemade treats in vacuum-sealed bags, said it made her feel like she was giving something back, said it helped her remember she was more than what they'd tried to take. Nora, for her part, hadn't gone back to big hospitals or state-funded facilities. She took a position running a small community clinic in a town barely large enough for its own zip code. Patients knew her by name. Kids drew her pictures. The work was slower but real, and Ranger came with her. He was older now, slower. He'd developed a slight limp in his left hind leg. His muzzle had gone almost entirely white, but his eyes still tracked every movement, every shift in wind, every unfamiliar sound. Most afternoons he curled beneath the front desk or by the back door of the clinic. But when dusk came, when the sky turned orange and the world got quiet, he stationed himself by the window. Not out of habit, out of duty, because some part of him still remembered the hallway, the door, the scent of something wrong. He hadn't forgotten. Neither had Nora. It was a rainy Thursday when a little boy with wide eyes and an inhaler clipped to his belt walked up to the front desk. He pointed to Ranger, who was dozing nearby, ears twitching. "Is that the dog from the picture on the wall?" Nora looked up from the chart she was filling out. "That's him." The boy stared. "He saved somebody, didn't he?" "He did. But nobody believed him at first, right?" Nora closed the chart gently, looked the boy in the eyes. "That's true." The boy hesitated, thinking carefully, then asked, "Does that mean people failed?" Nora smiled, the kind of smile that carried the weight of having once been very wrong and lucky enough to fix it. "No," she said softly. "It means the dog never did." Ranger stirred, lifting his head just enough to meet her gaze. His tail thumped once, lazily. The next morning, a small envelope arrived at the clinic. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Claire standing in her garden, holding a tomato in one hand and waving with the other. She looked healthy. Not completely healed, maybe, but entirely alive. Nora pinned the photo to the bulletin board, just beneath the framed commendation Ranger had received from the state. Later that night, after the last patient left and the clinic lights dimmed, Nora made 2 cups of tea. One for her. One that sat on the counter, untouched, for no reason at all. Ranger lay on his bed by the window, breathing slow, head resting on his paws. Nora sat beside him, sipped quietly, then whispered, "You knew the truth when the rest of us wouldn't even look." She reached down and stroked the spot behind his ear that made his eyes close halfway in contentment. "Some heroes don't wear badges," she said. "They just wait until someone finally listens." Outside, the night moved on. Peaceful. But this time, it was real. And Ranger watched every inch of it. If you followed this story all the way here, thank you. Ranger's journey reminds us of something bigger, something we often forget in our rush to trust people over instinct or protocol over presence. Sometimes the quietest voice in the room isn't human. Sometimes it's a bark, a look, a refusal to walk past a door everyone else ignores. That's why we created this channel, to honor dogs like Ranger and every loyal heart that still believes in truth, even when no one else does. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe to German Shepherd for more real-life stories of courage, loyalty, and the animals that change everything. And maybe ask yourself, what would you do if your dog refused to move and the whole world told you nothing was wrong?